Good evening, everyone. I'm Councillor Daubney. This is the December meeting of the Children Education and Communities Policy and Scrutiny Committee. The date is the 20th of December, if you're watching the live stream later, and it's 5:30, so we're going to make a start. Can I first of all ask for declarations of interest from any members of the committee? Councillor Webb.
Thank you, Chair. It's not a new declaration, but it's worth mentioning that Andrew Daly, who's presenting on one of the items, is my boss. So
Thank you very much.
Staring straight at me. There you go.
Make sure you behave. I must declare an item, an interest in items 1 and 6. I sit as a City Council observer on the Board of Trustees for York Citizens Theatre Trust with Councillor Crawshaw and Councillor Hook, but we don't take any part in decision making. I'm also a director of Work with York in common with 2 other city councillors. Work with York procures professional staff within children's services for the authority. Thank you for that. Councillor Waller.
We're in this, right, although it's already on the register of interest, I am a governor at York High School and at Westfield Primary, which are both mentioned in the reports today.
Thank you for that. Do I have any apologies for members of the committee? I think everyone's here for the members. Thank you. Oh yes, Councillor Baker's not with us. Right, can you record Councillor Baker's apologies? Thank you.
She's not apologizing.
Well, okay. She's absent then. Okay. The minutes of the meeting of the 1st of November. Can I have those agreed?
Yeah. Just 1 point, Chair. The minutes are absolutely fine, but on the page 10 of the report, it's page 10. Hang on. Oh, page 6 of your report on the work plan item. I was just wondering if we get an update on action 2 and action 3. Whether we're going to receive a scrutiny report, CYSCP, and then whether we were going to have a slot on feedback from Ofsted around SEND reports, and if so, when.
I think I can answer the second question. That's going to be in February, I believe, according to when Ofsted report. I'm not so sure about question 2. I
think it was maybe one for Martin regarding independent scrutiny reports. From the independent scrutiny, we were talking about whether we'd get one before that person left post or not.
I will chase that up. So that person has or is about to leave post. So I will make sure that that's circulated.
Yeah, that's just whether it'll come around or not.
Okay, thank you very much. We have no public participation tonight, so I would not ordinarily move on to the York Citizens Theatre Trust item, but I do understand that Tom Bird isn't with us just yet. So in that case, I can move on to the behaviour and attendance item. In that case, ask Pauline, are you going to? I thought Maxine was here. Oh, sorry, Maxine. I knew I'd seen you earlier. Right. Would you like to pick that one up for us? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Chair. The report that you have in front of you provides a summary of the current position around exclusions and school attendance across York. We've split it down through the secondary and primary phases. In common with what's happening nationally, attendance is proving difficult to recover following the pandemic. We are doing an awful lot of work, very focused work, which you'll hear about this evening, to ensure that we are starting to really make inroads into promoting good attendance in the city, and we have got an attendance campaign running this year. Dan and also Andrew Daly, who's here to represent the York Schools and Academies Board as the chair of the board this year, will be mentioning some of the work that the board has sponsored, and also some of the work that Dan's been taking forward with colleagues in both the primary pastoral forum and also the secondary pastoral forum. So I'm going to hand over first of all to Dan and then to Andrew.
I think it might be useful to do the report in two parts. So to look at the exclusion data and then the attendance data, so that the strands aren't too broad. So in terms of exclusions, there is permanent exclusion data, and then there is suspension data, which is the new government language for fixed terms of infants. And we've tried to provide an overview of those in short summary, because the council have had the chance to look at the data prior to the meeting, but we are looking at a potential rise in our permanent exclusions that is replicated across our regional partners as part of the pandemic recovery, and there is also a projected rise in terms of our school suspensions. We're ongoing considering that alongside our head teacher colleagues. It's a regular focus of our meetings. The permanent exclusion rate has slowed from 9 in the first half term to 3 in the second as part of those conversations, and it's an ongoing focus for us in terms of managing that aspect of things. You'll see later in the document that the average cost of permanent exclusions for local authority is worked out as 370,000 because of additional life disruptions that follow. So we're keen to, from the public purse point of view, and also from child's best interest point of view, look to work with that as well as we can do. We also know that if a student leaves the school for a permanent exclusion, it takes a place in our specialist provisions, which we also would like to have protected for our EHCP population. So there will be times when it's not avoidable, but we want to make sure that our system is being as positive as it can be in terms of managing those cases in setting. The other thing is also that we want young people in school, and we don't want to break attendance to have more people in community rather than in school settings during the day. You will see that there's a bit of a breakdown in terms of the suspension rate in terms of primary clusters. So you can see that there's a bit of difference between from 5 to 61 in terms of our different ward areas. And what I would want to really advocate is some of the detail of the support that's already been successful. So from YSAB, we've invested £150,000 at a sports centre at York High, which has substantially aided their suspensions and permanent exclusion rates. That was a big part of their recent very, very warmly received Ofsted inspection, and it has also managed the traffic and the number of students who needed extra support, a different provision across the city, which has aided all the schools in terms of that aspect of things. And we have also put in place the Wellbeing in Mind team from NHS Central investment in the west and the north of the city, following the evidence of where the greatest need would be. So I'll pause there. There's other detail within the paper, and see if there's questions that follow on the exclusions. I'll see if Andrew wants to add anything, and then we can move separately to attendance.
Thank you. Andrew, do you want to come in there?
Welcome. Thank you for having me tonight. I appreciate being here, both as the chair of YSAP and the head of Archbishops. Just to echo what Dan and Maxine have said there, really, we have seen an increase in both permanent exclusions and suspensions as part of the pandemic recovery, which will have been talked about in great detail over time. I think the point I would make is both in terms of head teachers across the city and in terms of YSAP as city leaders, we are looking really, really carefully at everything we can do to keep children in school. And I know we'll come to attendance in a second. We're currently looking at the layers of support in each individual school to try to prevent suspensions and then try to prevent a repeat of suspensions. And then we're looking at a city level at YSAP for those small number of young people who do end up with repeat exclusions, what other provision is there for to support those young people? And I think that links to the SEND provision conversation and the wider SEND document around the investment in SEND across the city. So we recognise the situation, albeit not just a York one, but one that York leaders are working hard to try to support the young people as part of that. And just like Dan, happy to answer questions that might come up based on that.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Can I start the question? I wanted to hear something about the operation of the support centre at York High and just how it works in practice.
Yeah, so it was co-constructed. It came from a meeting where we went to look to engage the school around some growing exclusion figures. We identified that repeat exclusions was a risk, not just because it kept breaking a chance for success, but also because York High operate a positive behaviour system which escalates, and you need to keep your sort of your record clean for a bit to go back to the start of that escalation. Some students weren't able to maintain a long enough clean period, so they were always stuck in an escalating system of exclusion. What we identified was they needed a pause. So we took them into a short-term intervention. So they worked as a small group with carefully appointed staff with qualified teaching status, and they worked in a way which was very much clearly designed to not just keep them up with their curriculum, but to give them the skills to then go back successfully into mainstream. So they had 6 weeks of intensive complete withdrawal within the centre. They then went partially back in on a half and half plan, with the top and tail of the day remaining within the centre and then going back into lessons for the middle part of the day. And then in the third half term, they went fully back in, but they were allowed to use the support and the relationship in the centre to have that as the resolution to any issues that arose. And I think of the 36 students that went through it, the school would claim success with over 30 of them in terms of breaking the cycle of exclusion. The other thing we were able to do was to do a year 6 group in the final half term. So students that the primary school cluster were concerned about managing the transition and managing that step up to the positive behaviour system at York High. They had a half a term of having that modelled to them and being trained around it, so it was less of a cliff edge moment when they started in the September, and that's been very successful and has been replicated.
Thank you, Dan. That's very helpful. Any other questions? Councillor Fitzpatrick.
Some comments, first of all. Firstly, welcome, Andrew. It's good to see you. I remember years ago in Hull Road, the first thing I did when I became councillor there was to come to your school and talk to you. And I was made very welcome for the whole time I was councillor in Hull Road. Around this sort of area, actually, this was the kind of thing that I was asking questions about. So I'm pleased to see things coming on so well. I'm just wondering, as an offset inspector who hasn't inspected for quite a while, I'm pleased to see reference still to statistical neighbours when we're measuring things. How much notice do we take of that these days, Maxine, in general? Because we talk, sorry, can I just say, because we do talk a lot about neighbouring regional local authorities. Well, we know that York, I use the word better. I'm sure there's another word I should use instead of that. But expectations and results and everything else in York, if we are only comparing ourselves locally, it does need to be statistical, doesn't it, really?
Yeah, and obviously for us, our statistical neighbours are more important than our neighbours within Yorkshire and Humber because of the fact that we do have a very different profile to the rest of Yorkshire and Humber. Having said that, there's also things that we've been learning, and Dan's been learning from being part of those regional groups, particularly where it looks as though we're at variance with certain of those indicators. And again, we've been sharing those with colleagues in YSAB so that they're aware of that benchmarking. Every school is poring over benchmarks all the time. And one of the things about the school colleagues in York is that they're very, very interested in how they compare both with regional and with statistical neighbours. So it's one of the things that we can only really know whether we're having the impact that we need to have if we're keeping an eye on what similar local authorities to ourselves are doing, and are we holding up in the same way that they are? So it's really important that we're using that statistical data all the time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maxine. Councillor Webb.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a few questions really. Hopefully the first one's quite straightforward. You say at the bottom of page 12, paragraph 5, where you've got the table of permanent exclusions. You talk about that this would project a rate of 40 at the current rate. Do we expect it to be a steady rate over time, or would you normally see, for example, more at the start of a year and less at the end? So that's my first point. And then my other one for now is on the paragraph 8 on the impacts, the third bullet point. Fewer students have been placed at Danesgate through managed moves, with more held in mainstream settings. I think on the whole that is a really positive move, but is that, what policy changes have happened? I doubt that's by accident. Can you just talk us through the decision making there?
Yeah, so in terms of the rate of permanent exclusions, it doesn't tend to be front-ended. It tends to be fairly steady through the year. What we've looked to address was a real spike in the first half term. So to have had 9 the first half term is a real change in presentation, which is why we've engaged quickly with our school community. In terms of the projection to 40, we're hoping that comes down. We've moved from 9 to 3 in the second half term, and that's not been that's been through all of the discussions rather than a sea change in necessarily the presentations. So now I suppose you would map it up to around about 35, and hopefully we'll see that move through in terms of a reduction in where it will finally reach. In terms of the situation with Danesgate, I think a few things came together there. We have significantly increased the routines where students access Danesgate. We've worked with tighter fair access criteria in terms of the students that discussed for moves aside from permanent exclusion, and that came in because there was a national tightening around risks of off-rolling allegations being made to schools, and about only moving to specialist settings with very clear rationale and very clear sight of those happening. There's also a situation which you'll be aware of from the overall discussion that the financial envelope of how large Danesgate had become without maybe the tighter gatekeeping we've now got in place was not a long-term tenable position for the council to be in, and we needed to also manage the increase in the SEN population and the increase in the HCP students who were well suited to that setting and well suited to that strategy. I'm not sure, Maxine, if you want to add to that at all.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I think the key thing is that we now have a much more robust admissions process around Danesgate, which means that as with general admissions, it's very, very clear the criteria around admissions to Danesgate, whereas previously that wasn't as clearly articulated. I think as well, to be fair, some of this is the work that has been done by Dan and by the pastoral leaders in really improving the fair access processes and the protocols and the way that they're working. Very much more effective in terms of the decision making. People are much clearer on applying consistent thresholds around the use of those places at Danesgate, so that they are being used for the right young people in order to put in the interventions that are needed for them, and schools have developed their own approach to the graduated behaviour response and are putting in the layers in front of that's having a real difference.
As a supplementary to that, I'm glad you mentioned sort of the funding aspects of that. I think it would be remiss of me as not to say that the graduated response that you're talking about in schools is putting increased pressure on schools and school teachers, and that there's an argument for, maybe some of that was needed rather than direct Danesgate mode, if you will. But you've mentioned in paragraph 4 about the additional investment that essentially has been required to sort of combat that. Do we see that investment continuing? And what pushback from schools are we hearing about this changing process? Because I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but it's definitely change, and there will be pushback from that side.
I think we're managing, definitely taking the school system with us. We've increased other opportunities around introducing an alternative provision directory, which allows schools to commission support of a different nature to our specialist setting, which is well used. I think in terms of the overall dynamic, it actually brings our PRU size down to being of a very similar size to other local authorities. Previously, it was far larger than the typical PRU offer would be in other areas. I think in terms of the way that the school system copes, that's been usefully developed, and I think there's a couple of things which we probably will have added to that challenge, one of which being the pandemic and the pandemic recovery, which has had an impact in behaviour. And the second aspect in terms of things would be the whole system realigning. We know that the current scraps, white and green paper, which have got significant amounts of mainstream ownership described in them, the spirit of that will still be something which is a point of discussion for school settings in the city and beyond.
I think as well, one of the things obviously that we've been doing is looking at the role of Danesgate as our specialist SEMH provision and ensuring that they are able to do the job that has the greatest impact on those with the highest levels of need. So it's been really important to actually work on remodelling Danesgate so that it's able to deliver that highly specialist intervention for young people with a primary need of SEMH, and they've been successfully doing that. Danesgate now largely delivers small group provision rather than heavily one-to-one, which it previously did. It is running a curriculum model which allows children to make progress, and that's all been part of the journey of reshaping the system. So children and young people then are getting a much better and more focused provision basically from Danesgate than that they've had previously, and it's really helping them to develop their specialist skills around that cohort of very complex young people, and it will help with their progression in the future.
It's also for the wider discussion here. Danesgate is able to offer a full-time delivery. When it was at the size it was previously, it couldn't offer a full-time delivery, which meant students being in their communities rather than their setting more. We know we can do the legal offer of 25 hours for all the students at that setting.
Can I just come in there, Bob, a little bit on that? Just from the point of view, if you like, from a head teacher sat here, and from YSAP point of view, the system is definitely moving together on this. I think there's not a pushback from schools around this plan. I think that we hope for a little bit more sufficiency in the system. All right, I think we all hope for that. Hence the investment around the additional provision around SEND needs at different levels. That will be welcome. And you might just be talking about 10 places here and 10 places there, but they can make all the difference. And I think what's been said about Danesgate is really, really important, to make sure that provision is for the right children, and that for children who need something a little bit different, there's fewer of them, but there is some of that provision there in terms of your typical PRU provision. There will be need for some of that. But there's also the drive from schools to make sure that we are doing all that we can. So we also benefit from having a teaching school hub in the city, and one of the parts of that hub is to provide training. And one of the things the city's focusing on this year is around specialist training around SEN. Right, so I know at Archbishop's and a lot of the schools we're all doing the adaptive teaching training. There's SEN champion training going on throughout the city to make sure that we can say as class teachers that we are doing everything we can in our class to meet the needs of young people, to know that as a school, we are doing everything we can to meet the needs of young people. Because at that point, that's when we have the conversation with Dan and with Maxine and say, we have a young person we're struggling with, what provision is available? And actually we're all of one mind on this, but I do think it's fair to say we do need a little bit more sufficiency in the system because of some of the additional challenges we're facing currently.
Thank you, Andrew, and promise, last one from me.
Okay.
It is on that very theme, really, is, you know, that we've talked about the investment that's happened. But if we're really honest, I mean, if you look at the numbers, I mean, secondary suspensions, for example, the prediction is up to 2,300. So, you know, following on from what Andrew said in terms of additional sufficiency needs, you know, what specifically is needed?
So in terms of, first of all, in terms of those suspensions, what Dan and others of us are doing and making sure that in all our schools, our bar is at the same place, okay, that actually we're all doing everything and more to prevent those suspensions happening, okay. Some of this is definitely still coming out of the pandemic. As a head teacher, I can say my colleagues were facing some challenges that, and you know yourself, Bob, that are perhaps a little bit more marked than they were previously, right? So it's making sure that we can do all we can, and that is at a cost to schools' budgets, right? So if we're sending a young person out to the skills centre to do a GCSE one day a week, that there's a cost to that. So I think it's about, as a school system, Bob, looking at the whole offer, right? What can we do together? What can we source more effectively? Because there is a need for a little bit more.
Thank you, Andrew. Councillor Fitzpatrick.
Thank you on that. I'm pleased to see the direction that Danesgate is going in, and I'm pleased to hear the way it's described. I was on the periphery of the appointment of the head teacher there last time round in place of Councillor Webb, I hasten to add. And yes, because when I used to visit it, I'm talking 10 years ago now, I did have concerns at that point in time. It was trying to be all things to all people. And you know, it was very difficult to see how it was meeting all those needs. I've always had a concern about primary age children being permanently excluded, or for any length of time. And at that point in time, it seemed very comfortable for some of those children to be there, you know, and the challenge wasn't there. And also, you know, the labelling aspect of it. What secondary school wants to take a child maybe who has been very unsuccessful? So the question is, I think we're led to believe, I'm thinking NEETs now at the other end as well. Is it the case that YSAB will pick up every child in York somewhere or other in terms of permanent exclusions at that level? There will be somewhere where they are catered for so that they don't become part of the NEET population.
One of the things, obviously, in terms of permanent exclusions, Councillor Fitzpatrick, is that's where the work of Dan and the fair access needs makes a huge difference, because those children are owned by all schools in the city, and there's an agreement amongst those pastoral leaders that they will work together to find the right solution for those children who are in those highest levels of need, who are finding school really difficult, and also that's proving very difficult for the schools that they're in as well, because of the way that they're reacting to that school environment. And so that whole process has been an understanding, hasn't there, Dan, this year, that if you are permanently excluding somebody's coming your way, and we own it as a system. So that very definitely is taking place now.
Sorry, Chair. Is there anything we can add about that?
Yeah, and I'll have to talk about the NEETs as well. So first of all, on the bit that Maxine's just said, we take all our students have been permanently excluded, once they're through the legal process and any appeals, to our monthly fair access meeting. And we take advice from their previous setting, from Danesgate, and from my own interactions with the family to make the right decision. And that can be either to place them back in school fully, to place them back on a dual role with Danesgate over a trial period, or to agree that Danesgate is the best place to meet their needs. Of the 12 permanent exclusions we're talking about, 10 of those are now back in the system and being supported by a new school. And we work in that regard. With regards to the NEETs, our NEET figures remain really strong. I was looking at the SEN report that's been brought out just on the FA website prior to coming in. I think it's around about, it's an average in the 80s for the national picture who are still in education, employment or training. For ourselves, it's well over 90, and the destinations for Danesgate are particularly strong in that regard as well. So the NEET figures for the city, I think, are a point of real pride.
Very much, Dan. I've just got one final question. Can you describe, please, the work of the research school to improve school attendance through enforcement and early help strategies? How do they take that
Yeah,
forward?
shall I just give a very quick overview of attendance as well, just as the second piece, if people are happy to move on from exclusions. So attendance has been another point of slow recovery post-pandemic, and there's a point of both new government legislation, but also our own council and school concern around that. YSAB have invested £100,000 in us widening our attendance team. Previously, we had one attendance advisor who was line managed by myself strategically. So we've appointed by YSAB's investment, we've appointed a data and enforcement officer for school attendance, and we've appointed a school attendance lead. Now, linking into your question there, YSAB agreed to do that if the research school would underwrite with a analysis of the impact of those posts, that the money had been well spent. So the school attendance lead is one of the roles there, and she, Stephanie, who starts in January, will be meeting the government duty to have a termly meeting with each setting to look at their data and to look at areas for improvement. But we're also using Stephanie to model early help. So she will lead an early help case in each school, not to become the only person doing that in the city, but to model that strength of practice, the signposting, the engagement, the variations which make a difference, so that schools can then replicate that themselves with any number of cases. The government demands two different sort of strands on this. For unauthorised absence, they look at increased enforcement, but they're also really pushing the early help mechanisms as well within that. If you would look at your papers, I'm sure you have before the meeting, you can see that our primary attendance is improving really quickly, and we're delighted with that. Well inside national averages for both overall and vulnerable groups, and the position for them in terms of persistent absence is likewise strong. So that's the students who have more than 10% absence. Secondary, we've improved from last year, but we are not where we want to be yet in terms of national averages. A deeper analysis of that, you can see it's that we have a number of students who really haven't recovered at all post-pandemic. So we've got just over 200 students who are below 35% attendance at school at the secondary age, and those are a concern for us in terms of how we then manage that and help schools offer a route back into settings.
Just on this, looking at free school meals, really, it's encouraging to see at the primary stage that the numbers are going in slightly in the right direction there, and worrying for secondary, really. That cohort always concerns us, concerns everyone who's involved in schools generally, and you know, we as a council and whichever political party is in power, we always wonder about, you know, should we be supporting that more or not, or whatever. Can you say something about that cohort of children that are on free school meals? Do they have breakfast clubs as well? I mean, alongside that, within YSAB in general, or what is there, I suppose, around that indicator that could be done better, do we think? Or is it just post-COVID, maybe?
I don't think it's just post-COVID, and I think we can see that the national figure at secondary for free school meals is really concerning too, nearly half for both cohorts. So I know I think the other reason the research of school working with this is to see what learning there is. I think schools are creatively offering breakfast clubs. I know York High had investment from a benefactor where they've had a really successful 4-week spell of offering free breakfasts, which have really had impact. I think what we hope to get from this, especially using the early help model, is to understand the barriers for this population more. Are any of them linked to cost of living? Are any of them linked to housing? Are any of them linked into debt effects or changes within family dynamics between family splits, etc., which have emphasised any of those? So I think if we're working across 59 different settings and doing that in quite an interrogative way, we're really hoping to have lessons which we can share back to the system. I mean, I would agree that nearly half, both nationally and in York, of that population being below 90% attendance is something we'd want to act on collectively.
I think as well, YSAB is looking at through the attendance projects. That attendance project actually did start at Archbishop Holgate's, where there was quite a dramatic improvement in the attendance of children on free school meals. So the work that Dan is now doing has actually grown out of that learning and that project. So the pastoral leader at Archbishop Holgate's has been heavily involved in the development of the attendance work that's running this year. Andrew, do you want to say something about?
Yeah, I will. And it's really good to know that this committee focuses really closely on the most vulnerable groups of students, which is really, really important. Yeah, before COVID, we did see a big improvement in free school meals attendance at Archbishop's, and that was at the same time as we saw well, we have a 5-year pattern of strong academic performance for our free school meal children at Archbishop's as well, which books the trend to some extent, and the two are connected. I have to be honest and say that since COVID, we haven't recovered our attendance around free school meal children as well as we would have liked to either. But the system was really one that you would have your usual attendance systems where you had a close eye on all young people, but you would have an additional resource that focused on breaking down the barriers for those most vulnerable students. So we have a member of our intensive support worker, we call her as part of the pastoral team, who has a caseload of anything between 10 or 30 young people, who rings them up first thing in the morning, will go around and pick up, will provide breakfast. And it's not rocket science, it's just that additional support for a group of young people. And I think that pattern is being modelled now elsewhere. And I think that it can still be effective if you pick the right children. And what I mean by that is that when Dan, you're talking about attendance, or Maxine, of children less than 40%, if you're down to the young people with 10 or 20%, this isn't going to work with these children, okay? And they need something even more. What this will do is work with the children who have just dipped into persistent absentees, or who have 70, 80%. We can get them back into the building. We can utilise the wellbeing workers, which we also fund centrally. We can break down those barriers. So for that group of free school meal children who perhaps are just falling into persistent absentees, I think this attendance project will work really well. For those young people who just haven't really returned post-COVID, and I think there are examples across all of our schools, that is a much bigger issue, which we're managing case by case.
Just as Andrew's mentioned, the wellbeing in the wellbeing workers. So I think it's important to note that schools again contribute over £100,000 to our universal offer there, which is across all clusters having a wellbeing worker, a team of 6 with 1 team leader. And I mentioned it briefly before, but the Wellbeing in Mind, which is the centrally funded NHS mental health support teams, they are working currently in West and North, and we're having a new team arriving later this year, which will supplement our wellbeing workers rather than replace them. But we know that wellbeing input is very much part of the recovery. In terms of looking at those students with more embedded absence, we have got focus groups both at Vale of York and York High, and we've had some really successful inroads, not just always improving that attendance, though that has been the case in over 20 cases at York High to over 50%, but to make sure that there's really significant safeguarding conversations about these students who are out of sight, and we know what the dynamic is when they're not in school. One bonus that we already reached from the new posts is our school attendance advisor, who's very, very experienced within York, is able to be much more strategic and targeted with their work. So Mark is now looking at intensive conversations with schools that have got bigger populations of low attending pupils.
Just on that as well, I think that once the children come back to school, I don't think that secondary schools, and this is secondary what we're talking about, where the bigger issue is, have ever been better resourced in terms of their pastoral teams. I think all schools, I know 2 or 3 years ago, we made a really massive investment in pastoral care at Archbishops that was replicated across the city, I think. So you have more, you don't just have your traditional head of year, you have numerous assistant heads of years or pastoral support workers with them. You have the wellbeing workers. You have more schools now with school nurses, with school counsellors, with graduate counsellors. There's a whole raft of provision across our secondary schools now. And actually, once we get children back into school, that wraparound care in school can really help with that. So I think that getting them across the threshold really, Dan Maxine, I think is the key thing.
Thank you, Andrew. I think Councillor Webb's first.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think firstly on support workers in schools of all guises, and I'd highlight school nurses. I remember talking to them at another meeting, one of the health scrutiny committees. They're worth their weight in gold. Pastoral workers doing fantastic jobs in school, and I think that's been a really positive move. On page 15 of the report, you've got the data sets. You've got the secondary school persistent absence analysis. Obviously, they're different data sets because the national for 21-22, and obviously our CYC for 22-23. Now, you would expect those data sets to be different anyway, because obviously we were closer to the pandemic in the past. See, I can do my homework. And you would expect that to be changed. So was that a deliberate choice, that table, or you don't have the data, or is there any more you want to talk about?
Simply, we don't have the data. The attendance and exclusion data comes out lagged from central government. So the only data which we're in control of is the one which is actually the one in bold. I think it says italics. It's just a slight format change when it's come to yourselves. The bold one is in year. The ones beneath it are last year.
Yeah. Thank you. And then my other point was on page 18, paragraph 11M. Access to wider and centrally quality assured alternative provision. Sorry. I was wondering, can you just talk a little bit more about the alternative provision and sort of maybe give some examples of what that is, what that does, and how that helps?
Yes, so we've developed a directory of just over 20 alternative provision providers. Some of them are already operating within the city and were being commissioned generally through Danesgate. We made a decision to open that to direct commission by schools. So some of our bigger partners would be a sports academy called Evolve, a widening horizons program based around outdoor learning called Ad Astra, Build Country Classrooms, which is a farm, but it operates a teaching functional skills level on the same site. So there are 3 examples which hopefully give a bit of a description. These settings are private providers, so we have invested in quality assuring them in terms of health and safety, in terms of safeguarding, in terms of accident management, fire management, pretty much anything that you can think of, and sharing that with schools so that they have a very comprehensive QA to start from. They remain on the roll of the school if they attend any of these settings, so the school have to be completely secure that they are sending them to a safe setting to the standards that they would expect, and especially on anything around safeguarding, safer recruitment to the same standards that a school would be at. So we have, as I say, around about 20 plus providers. Schools are investing heavily in that when it's a relevant extra additional resource that they feel will benefit the young person. And the key thing for us is they offer something that the school can't offer themselves.
And just supplementary on that one, you mentioned that it's commissioned. What's the governance arrangements around, you know, obviously one school could say, oh, actually we need loads of children to go there, which might be the right thing, but how does that get controlled? Is that through YSAB, or is that through council or yourself?
They could do, as you say, it's a private commissioned agreement between school and the provider. We on our sort of 2.5 years in, and with some sort of interruption to things, we are looking to collect that detail this year to offer the same transparency as we do on lots of other mechanisms. So we know ourselves, we don't need to know that, but we know ourselves exactly who's where, and we can replicate back to the system how that investment has been done by different schools. What we did have a very transparent conversation around with secondary heads was around their different levels of spend on that, and they're having sort of their own peer scrutiny of those decisions.
I think as well, ultimately, the governance is provided by Ofsted, because they look at the arrangements that schools have got in place around their use of alternative provision. That's obviously looked at very, very rigorously to ensure that the schools are not doing what you said, Councillor Webb, which is, you know, sort of increasing the amount of time that young people are in alternative provision and not in school. And there are some guidelines around the fact that there are only so many hours that children can do in alternative provision during the week. It hasn't got to be the majority of their school week, which is an alternative provision. And as Dan said, the important thing is that this is something that a school cannot offer itself. It is distinctly different to the school offer, which helps to keep that young person engaged with going back into school. And what we're finding is that in the case of some young people, it's making a huge difference to the way that they're viewing their life in school.
It's also linked back to the conversation we had around exclusions earlier, and the idea of a graduated response, that actually if you're looking at a permanent exclusion of a child, and sometimes a massive one-off issue happens that you can't do anything about, but actually if you're talking about ongoing disruption, you have to look and measure what have you done to try to support or amend or do things differently for young people. And I think that alternative provision can be a valuable next step to hopefully prevent a permanent exclusion, or in the worst case scenario, provide evidence that a school has gone the extra mile to try to retain that student. Right? You really, though, only talking, or should only be talking, about small numbers of children in each school here, right? You're talking about a couple of children, 2 or 3 children in a year group, I would suggest, in terms of something like this, Bob.
Yeah, I mean, if it was becoming huge numbers, then the school's got to question how it's set up its curriculum and its teaching and learning, because obviously these are interventions that are used in a very targeted and time-limited way to improve a young person's engagement with mainstream school.
Right, thank you. I'm going to give Councillor Fitzpatrick the last question, then I'm going to move on to the agenda.
Actually, it's not a question. I'm going to take the opportunity to actually say something really. I don't expect any of the 3 of you to comment on what I'm going to say, but, you know, Andrew's absolutely right. The pastoral staff in a school are extremely important. Anybody that helps a child learn or improve their time in school is very valuable, and they're not teachers in every case, as we know. So I just find it very disappointing that we're looking at all of this when we know that there is an academy chain in the city that have found themselves in a situation where they are looking at maybe not valuing, I say maybe not valuing their additional staff, teaching assistants, as much as they should, because they are key to an awful lot of this. Any additional staff in school makes a big difference. So I have to say that in this forum, but I don't expect any comment.
Right. Thank you very much, Councillor Fitzpatrick. In that case, I'll just thank you all for the report and for coming along this evening to tease out the final points and provide information for us. So thank you all very much. I'm going to move on now, since Tom Bird hasn't joined us. I'm going to move on to the finance, monitoring and performance from Richard. Good substitution. Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you, Richard.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So this is Q2 monitoring report. As usual, I always tell you that this is an extract of the information that has already been presented to the executive in November. In addition to this particular monitor, we've now added there's a performance section being added, which I think was requested. That's been put together by the Business Intelligence Unit, and that's included at Annex A. So the summary on the financial projections is on page 23, paragraph 2, table 1, and that shows all of the service areas under the remit of this committee. The majority within the Corporate Director of Children Education's remit, but also is aligned there for the communities and qualities budget areas as well, which are clearly the remit of the committee. What that table is showing is a worsening of the position that we recorded at Q1, from about 7.3 million up to just under 8 million projected overspend. And you can see the range of areas where that projection comes through. I think before opening up to questions, it's obviously a slight frustration for us in terms of the timing of this particular paper, because clearly we're bringing this to you, probably a frustration for Martin as well, given when he started with the authority, but we're bringing this information to you in November, and generally it's based on expenditure and activity probably up to about the end of August. Even though we call it Q2, we have to start preparing it earlier. So this is showing a worsening of the position. We are now currently preparing the Q3 position, generally based on information up to the end of October. And I would be very surprised if when we brought the Q3 position back to you in February or March, it wasn't showing a significant improvement from this position. I'd be surprised if it wasn't at least £1 million better than it is here. So there's a bit of a frustration for us in what we're reporting. Clearly, we have to report what we had at that moment in time, but just to have that in mind when you're looking at this information. So I'll stop there and open it up for questions and comments.
Thank you, Richard. Any questions from the members? Councillor Webb.
Go on. You thought you were going to get away with it. Richard, thanks for this. One thing that obviously there is a significant overspend. We've talked many times about the significant overspends, and of course, every year we budget and we make decisions around savings or cuts, whatever you want to call it. One particular cut was around transport to Tadcaster Grammar, if I remember right, and that was budgeted 2 years ago. Has anything happened on that yet? Because it seems like it's a difficult decision to make, but it was a decision that was made and it would help the financial situation. And I just want a little bit of detail as to what the delay is.
If I take that one, obviously one of the things that we needed to do was do a full assessment of the impact of that decision around the Tadcaster bus. We will be starting a consultation in the new year, which will start to consult around taking that bus away. It will take, though it's important to recognise that it will take 5 years to deliver the full savings on that, because you can't just end it straight away. It will be stopping it. It will with the new year groups coming in. So that's something that we are now going to move to a public consultation, that we actually begin that piece of work. One of the things that we needed to very carefully do was risk assess what it would do around the availability of school places in York, to ensure that we'd actually got particular sufficiency in the secondary phase, because as you know, our secondary schools are very full, and Cottonthorpe would naturally lie within the catchment of Fulford School. Fulford's been undergoing quite a lot of capital works in the last 2 years. It would not have been able to absorb new children until those capital works were done. So we had to think very, very carefully about how we got that timing right to ensure that it wasn't having a detrimental effect on the system as a whole. We also as well have recontracted all our school bus contracts and the taxi contracts, and improve the capacity within the school transport team so that they're able to keep a much more finite, really detailed oversight of these contracts now. We started with policy change around eligibility for transport just over 18 months ago. So we've really improved the way in which that eligibility is identified. And parents now have to make a formal application for school transport, which again has given us a really effective oversight of those decisions around eligibility for transport. So it's been all of a piece really, and it's been making sure that things have been timed effectively so that all bits of the system are ready for those changes.
And just to say in terms of financial impact of that, that happening, I think we had budgeted for a saving of about 18,000 in this current financial year for the phased implementation of that saving. So that's how much that's adding to this pressure.
Yeah, I admit that we're talking a deck chair off the Titanic at this point, but it is a really, it's more a point of governance, really. I think, it seems a little bit cart before the horses that there was a planned budget saving that was announced that allowed the administration to then do other things with the money that they said was going to be saved. And then it actually turns out that no, there's been a 2-year delay to do a study of whether that budget cut was possible. It just seems, is that a normal practice or is that not?
I think to be fair as well, some of it has been due to the fact that the last 2 years have been a bit unusual, and obviously we've had COVID in the way of making some of these changes as well. So what we've done is that has been it's been more delayed than we expected it to be, I'm afraid. So I'll admit, that's an issue that it should have happened more quickly for all sorts of reasons. It hasn't. Some of those were tied up with the fact that we're having to change our whole way of doing transport during COVID, and so we've been playing a little bit of catch up with that.
Thank you. Richard said that in preparing Q2 figures, by the time those come to us around March, I think you said, Richard, there's hope to see a significant improvement in certain areas. Can you kind of tell me which areas we would like to see improvement in? I mean, where the pressure is going to lessen it, essentially?
Okay, so
that could be Martin or Maxine.
Yeah, I mean, it's in 2 or 3 different areas. So within children's social care, we're seeing some improvements coming through now, particularly since the new management team have been in place in the summer. Huge changes in terms of the number of agency staff. That will take time to feed through to big figures in the monitor, because clearly a lot of that was factored in already so far, but we've seen a reduction of at least half, more than that, in terms of the number of agency staff within children's social care and across the service, and that's continuing to happen. So we'll see an impact of that in the remainder of the year, and clearly a huge impact of that in the 23-24 financial year. So that's really pleasing. And then in terms of placements for looked after children, so we're seeing some significant changes in terms of some of those packages of care. Some of the high cost ones have been reviewed quite quickly, and we've seen some reductions there. Again, these things take time to work through into the figures. So we're doing a little piece of work as well with the service, just to make sure that the right information is coming through and feeding in, and we're getting the most accurate projections there. But there's an impact in that area. Also, again, we just talked about transport, but there are some savings coming through in transport, particularly on the relooking of the routes for taxi routes. So there's a particular piece of work done within Maxine's team on that, which is generating some efficiency savings, which are coming through, and some quite tough negotiations in terms of the the annual increases, inflationary increases on some of those contracts, where I think in terms of the Q2 position, we'd assumed probably a prudent position in terms of what that might mean in terms of where inflation was. And as the negotiations have settled through, and again with the work that Maxine's team have done, they've not been as much as we were anticipating in that Q2 monitor. And then we've also looked at some of the good progress that's been made on the safety valve work that we're looking at Q3. And we'd built in a little bit of headroom within that. With the targets that we'd set within that, we'd been cautious in terms of what we said we could deliver to the DFE. We're at least on target and a bit ahead of that. So some of the transfers that we were going to have to make from the DSG into the general fund, we've not had to do that to quite the same degree. So that's been put into the pot, likely to be put into the pot at Q3. That bit is clearly one-off because we will need that funding in the following year. But those are the three or four main areas where things are certainly getting better in the information that I've seen from the Q3 position that will come into you later.
Thank you, Richard. That's very helpful. Councillor Heaton.
Thank you. Just there on agency staff, I've lost count of how many times we talked about agency staff over the last 4 or so years. One of the things that we've said a number of times is you always expect some agency staff to be within the system. When we're talking about reducing that by about 50%, how close does that bring us to the sort of expected baseline, I suppose, as you describe it, where you're naturally going to have some in? And is there a way we can actually sort of measure that and keep an eye on that from this side of things?
I think there's probably two answers to that. I can answer the bit in budgetary terms and financial terms, in that we don't budget for agency staffing. Our budgets are based on permanent staffing. We don't build any vacancy factors into the children's social care budgets, frontline staffing, because we assume we always need people in post. There's no vacancy factors, as they are in other council budgets. The bit about in practical terms, what level would be, that's probably more of a question for Martin, but we don't budget for any agency staff at all.
I think it's difficult to predict. I think we're in a very strange market nationally. So we know that nationally, the use of agency across social workers become very damaging. It's something that the government are trying to get to try and have a national response. And they're looking at a number of areas that they could possibly implement legislation, and that would include, for example, any social worker would need 5 years child protection experience before they could go to agency, whereas currently they can go in year 1 of us being a social worker. They may look at capping the national rate, a bit like agency, the bank staff that are used in schools. So if you're a bank member of staff that works in a school, my understanding is that you're paid the same as the school teacher that's next to you. But I think we are in a favourable position in terms of the direction of travel. So we're moving to a permanent senior management structure in social care. The next layer down, next tier down, will be a permanent structure as of January, and we've reduced by 50% of the social workers. Our intention is to reduce to 0. I think we can get there. I think we need to make sure that York is seen as a outstanding employer. Lots of things we can do about providing that message. But I think we're the two issues of how you spend money on children and children's placements and what your workforce looks like are completely entwined. So unless you have a permanent workforce, you can't develop the culture and sort of values that you want within a system that makes the right decisions for children. So that's an area that we're putting a huge amount of effort in terms of making sure that we recruit and we retain the very best staff that we can get. So we're moving in the right direction, and it's made rapid progress in the last 3 or 4 months.
Thank you, Martin. Councillor Fitzpatrick.
Okay, can I just say, Martin, I'm very impressed with the adverts that have been going out recently as well, particularly the use of social media and things, which isn't necessarily my forte, but they've come to my attention, the adverts to attract social workers. And yeah, let's hope that happens, because I know that that's what you want and that's what we all want, really. So yeah, well done for that. I think, you know, that from what we're saying, in all ways, we want all York children to be educated and looked after and cared for in York. So the Tadcaster Grammar School argument kind of is one end of the scale, as opposed to the out-county ones that I'm always concerned about, Richard, that are so expensive. So if we're saying that we want to bring them in, you know, and you know, because it's the right thing to do for them to be educated and looked after in the community in which they grow up and have grown up in and will return to, then the Tadcaster Grammar School issue, you know, it is similar, really. We want our children to be going to York schools as far as possible. And if parents want to make a choice elsewhere, then that's, you know, the financing of that can't come from the council, really. So I'm glad that I hope we're moving in that direction.
Yeah, I completely agree. So our ambition should absolutely be for young people in York to be brought up in York and to go to school in York. And we're in the very fortunate position as a city to have every secondary school as either good or outstanding. So we can not only make that commitment, but it's the right thing to do. I think in terms of those young people that are placed in external provision outside the city, we don't know the quality as much as we would like. And there have been some recent national examples where that has been called into question, even though they're under the same regime of inspection. They have social work visits, they have reviewing officers go to see them, but they're not close enough for us to understand whether we're providing the best care and support that we can. So absolutely an ambition to make sure that we move to as many young people as possible being brought up in the city.
You, Martin. Councillor Webb.
Thank you. The data set that the performance data that's been added on is really, really valuable. A couple of things I noticed from it. One, a third of our schools are oversubscribed by more than 5%, I think it was. That seems quite a lot. And you know, that's positive. Does that mean that some of our schools are undersubscribed? And if so, you know, what are we doing to tackle that? And the other one is a separate issue, maybe for Martin to deal with, and it was about percentage of children in care for more than 1 year with an up-to-date dental check. And I just wondered if it, as corporate parents, is it something that we look at? I know there's been a real problem with getting dentist places in York for anybody, but it's, you know, as corporate parents, it's our job to make sure it happens for those children in care. So is that something that happens, or something that social workers deal with, or how's that work?
Yeah, so I'll deal with the second question first. So in terms of dentists, both health checks and dentist checks are something we absolutely obsess on for looked after children. The data in York is actually more favourable than the national data, so we are doing well, despite the lack of dentists in terms of access. But it's something we work with strategic health partners with on a continuous basis in terms of making sure young people do have good access. And that's also about working with foster carers who on a day-to-day basis are looking after children's needs.
In terms of the question about oversubscription in schools, yes, the picture does look different in different parts of the city. What you've got to remember is that the general admissions round is largely driven by parental choice. So it isn't as simple as saying that there's room over in a particular school, so you just go there, because it is based around the fact that parents are allowed to preference certain schools over others. Obviously, we do encourage them in York to use all their 5 preferences, so that when we do then apply the oversubscription criteria, that you would get one of those 5 places allocated to you. We do as well where parents have expressed no preference or have only used one of their preferences, then do place in schools that have got room available. But it is, as I say, admissions is totally driven by parental choice, and it's very difficult then to really track what's driving some of those things, particularly as Martin said, we've now got 100% of secondary schools good or outstanding. That doesn't mean though that all of them are full. There's still parents who preference certain schools over others, even though they're carrying the same Ofsted grading.
Thank you very much. And just looking at indicator 147, which looks at the percentage of care leavers aged 19 to 21 in suitable accommodation at the last birthday. It's dropped by some 4.5%. Is there any particular reason for this? Because I know we're some way off our target of 95%.
So there is a challenge in terms of accommodation. There's certain types of accommodation, such as custody and others, that cannot be included as suitable accommodation, even though you have no choice but to be there. We are working really hard. York is actually relatively good in terms of its ability to work alongside housing to provide good accommodation. It is something that we're absolutely looking at as a priority across our care leavers to make sure that we get much better than the national average.
Thank you, Martin. Any other questions? In that case, thank you very much indeed. And we'll let you go. Thank you, Richard. That brings us to item 7A, Pauline, on the community hubs and holiday food. Pauline, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Originally, item 7A and 7B were combined, given that I think they both had hub in the title, community and family hubs, but they are distinctly two different things, even though the family hubs may evolve into some of the existing community hubs just because of the nature of the services that might be available from those community hubs. So I think, Martin, are you taking 7B in terms of family hubs? You're looking at,
yeah.
Is that all right? Yep. Okay. So item 7A covers a number of things, which is an update on the two scrutiny reviews that were finalised in the springtime this year and approved by executive in early June, or was it May? It was May. One was the scrutiny on the holiday and activities school holiday hunger report, and Annex A takes you through the responses to those recommendations and the work that we've done to meet those recommendations. And as you're aware, the cost of living crisis is now a real focus for all of the teams involved, and therefore an element of the funding that continues to be available to support families, particularly with the recommendations around the issue of food vouchers to families in need of support. The funding's been able to be continued through the availability of the Household Support Fund, and we've been notified that will continue into 2023-24. So there'll be two more issues of Household Support Fund from which we can continue to provide those vouchers. And as you will remember, the recommendation of the Scrutiny Committee was to provide wraparound debt and financial advice to those families claiming those vouchers. And of the 90 people that have been trained to issue those vouchers across the city, that wraparound support is available through those partnerships. Annex B is a summary of where we're meeting the principles outlined in the recommendations around the community hub report. And there is an update on where we're taking all of those activities. And again, many of these teams involved are very much still responding, no longer to COVID, but certainly to the cost of living crisis. So you will see that the features of community hub development is very much around supporting residents with financial inclusion, food poverty, loneliness and isolation, and more recently, warm places. and a small amount of funding that we've had to give out grants to support development of hubs and warm places has recently been awarded. So that was a grant of £40,000 for small grants across the city. I think there were about 11 awards made, and some of those will hopefully develop into more community hub provisions going forward. I am aware there's not statistics and data like some of the other reports, and a lot of the statistics and data sits within the cost of living report that went to executive more recently. But if this committee requires an update in the future, we'll bring some of those figures. In terms of the holiday activities and food update from paragraph 10 onwards on agenda page 43, you will see that officers have been working hard on the Christmas provision, and there's some feedback in there on the summer provision. And in between time, the officers have been working on identifying gaps and trying to plug some of those gaps for Christmas. Because of the nature of wintertime provision, it has been harder to secure providers, so the team themselves are providing some of the holiday and food activities over the winter period. But we are pleased to say that whereas last Christmas we provided 700 places, this Christmas we're hoping to provide 1,000 places. So we have made an improvement there. So happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Pauline. I think generally you've addressed our recommendations very thoroughly, and there's a comprehensive support there for people in need, right the way through from Annex A to Annex C. Any questions from other members that you'd like to raise? Andrew.
Thanks, Sharon, and thanks for the report. I think it's very true, and certainly in the case of Haxby, where we've watched the community hub basically grow from very little over the last four years, really. It has been a case of building on a series of crises, continuously, starting with COVID and the response to that, and the hub becoming the focus for efforts there. And then, as you say, sort of cost of living, and now warm spaces, adult loneliness, a constant set of issues sort of being built on, one on top of the other. I guess my question really, but it's all very much anchored by a set of individuals, and in particular in Haxby, a particular individual around which all of this happens. I guess the question really is what support does the council, or can the council offer these individuals, basically volunteers or paid staff, because they must really now be sort of feeling the burnout. My sort of fear, I guess, with some of these is they are very much built on particular individuals, going above and beyond, how the council makes sure that, they're not burnt out and don't disappear, and we don't lose that sort of resource that exists at the moment.
If we take the staff of the council, we are now a consolidated communities team. So whereas we used to have teams across children's and adults and place, we brought all of those together, and that brings some resilience with it within one management structure. So hopefully that will help us going forward. So whether it's the eco teams, it's with the community involvement officers, the ward staff, they're all now part of the same team. In terms of volunteers, you're absolutely right. A feature of the voluntary community sector is that people are very tired, and it's a real challenge for us to get volunteers going forward. But I think we've tried to bring them together. We have something called the Good Place Network. So where community groups have grown and volunteers have grown, we want to be able to develop them and provide support to each other. So I think at the first meeting there were over 20 groups that came together in the Good Place Network. There were 15 at the meeting last week. Hopefully we'll get more interest going forward. Hopefully that's just the cold weather. But again, you're really sharing best practice and support for each other. And of course, we've now got the food officers that are providing some support as well, identifying how they can work better together and provide mutual support to each other. And we've got the volunteer hub that we're funding through York CBS as well, which is helping us with recruitment for volunteers.
Thank you, Pauline. Councillor Webb.
Thanks. Yeah, sort of a follow on from that one, really. I think it's worth saying, yeah, as you said, Councillor Hollier, that the amazing work of volunteers in our city and of course council staff. And I think I just with the holiday activity and food programme, I think you know in Annex C you've outlined loads of provision. But how much of that would have been there anyway, because of, you know, amazing individual volunteers and, you know, what is it that actually this programme is adding? And my other question, I suppose, is my bugbear about this programme. If I'm a 16-year-old lad, right now, it's the Christmas holidays, what is there being provided specifically for me?
I think in terms of what you were saying about the mix of activities, obviously some of the activities did exist before the HAF. What's been useful though is that the HAF has brought additional funding, which was disappearing prior to this. So yes, some of this has been based around links that our communities officers have built up over a number of years, but they didn't have access to the funding to support the activities in the way that they now have through the HAF. So that's been one of the positive things in bringing new providers to get interested in providing things. Through the HAF steering group, we have identified that the older teenage group is definitely an area that we need to develop provision around. Some of that as well is starting to get their views around what they want to have as activities, because sometimes providers find they put activities on and it doesn't attract that age group. So some of this needs to be co-produced with those young people as well. And I know our HAF coordinator has got really strong ideas about that. We're also, as we're now clearer about the funding continuing, we're also going to make it easier to access the HAF activities by developing the booking systems so that they don't have to totally be dependent on it going through the schools. And we think that will make a huge difference as well to take up in communities.
Thank you. That's really helpful to know, because you know, I think it was one of the recommendations, it was something we talked about at the time, was actually what is there out there for older teenagers, because a lot of the provision is not aimed at them for obvious reasons, but it's one that I don't think we should avoid talking about.
Councillor Orrell.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just commenting on what you've just said, Maxine. I know initially when the HAF started, it was very dependent on the school provision and the teachers there providing the link to it and developing, and the varying success of different programs was very much dependent on particular teachers. And I think from what you're saying here, that has developed and it is less dependent in that way now, and we seem to be getting a broader input into it.
We've still got a few leading schools, obviously, that are still very interested in delivering HAF activities themselves. So, you know, there's still an important role that Westfield Primary plays and also Clifton Green Primary plays. But yeah, what we're seeing is new people coming into the programmes, and also it's spreading by word of mouth as well, that, you know, things are happening in these communities. The other thing that Shelby, the HAF coordinator, has really thought about this time is ensuring that there are no cold spots as well in the city where it's too difficult to find something. So ensuring that we've got that geographical spread is also a way in which the HAFs are being scaled up.
Thank you. Any other questions? Sorry, Councillor Fitzpatrick.
Yeah, I don't want it to sound too cynical, really, I suppose, but you know, we are a good committee. We can pat ourselves on the back for getting involved, throwing ourselves into scrutiny. We've been heavily involved in these scrutiny topics, and we've listened to good practice elsewhere, and we're very keen on things. I think Annex B, when we look at B there, I think, you know, it's just amazing how quickly things can change from when we did this scrutiny to looking at what we're saying there. I mean, obviously that is what we wanted to do, a clear desire to help people, not just tackle the source of the problems, well, rather look at the source of the problems, not just the symptoms. When all the time we're just fighting poverty, really. I mean, that is it, the cost of living crisis, the whole thing. So although I recognise that we are doing things, it is still quite depressing. And I have to say, Pauline, you're not alone in worrying about the word hub, because two of my bugbears are multi-agency and hubs, because, you know, they're quoted and thrown around, and really, when you actually analyse it, it's somebody kicking the responsibility to somebody else, certainly multi-agency when you're talking about young people. And I think hubs, you know, they can mean anything, really. And I would agree with them. Councillor Webb, I'm a director of Red Tower, for example, and I know that's not at all the kind of thing we're talking about here. But really, it's all delivered by volunteers. I've got serious concerns about local area coordinators and their future. And I've asked those questions you've been in meetings, Pauline, where I've asked those questions. We keep assuming that we've got this structure that will continue to work. And I just, you know, I'm just slightly depressed, really, but by it all, not by the attempts, but by actually what we've said there, that we want to tackle the source of problems. And the source of problems, really, to me, is poverty. And we need to look at the whole thing. And we're tinkering a bit around the edges, I feel sometimes.
Thank you, Councillor Fitzpatrick. Any other questions from members? In that case, I'll move on to item 7B on family hubs. I was very pleased to go to a training program designed as particularly for members to educate us exactly what a family hub is, and that certainly gave me a bit of grounding before I saw this report. So Martin, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So family hubs, I guess this report hopes to provide sort of a sense of what the government are trying to achieve over the last couple of years with the development of family hubs and what it means for York. And the two are slightly different, I think, at times. So the term family hub, and I agree, we are using the term hub in all sorts of different places. For me, it means a place that people gather together and they come from all parts of the community for different reasons, but actually it's a place that everybody can go to. And I think the evolution hubs of the community hubs in the city, in my experience, having been to have a look at a couple, are superb examples of that, actually, where you see difference, whether it's disabilities with able-bodied children and adults coming together. It's a range of people that come together from communities. So that's a term that for me, we can interchangeably use. I guess it's been used over a number of years to describe a single point of contact for families in terms of the concept of a family hub. The concept's evolved over probably the last couple of years, with the national government having a real priority to describe a system-wide model for providing family support services from pre-birth to 19 years or 25 for children with SEND. They're not a resurrection of children's centres, and they're not sure start. So family hubs are not another sort of sense of this is just access for children who are 0 to 5. It's absolutely about how do young people and their families and parents come together in one place. I guess the best way for me in describing the outcome of the family hub is that a parent that may have, I guess, worklessness that that is linked to poverty, that then links to behaviour and access to school for the child. It's about telling that story once. It's walking into one place, going in to access a number of services, whether it's across health, local authority, perhaps police, CAMS, a whole range of different services. It's about telling your story once and going into a place where you may not see those services in one building or in one place digitally, but actually you've only told your story to one person who will help you go through a range of different services and almost handhold you. Whereas at the moment, there's lots of signposting, and for all of those different things that exist within a family, you're handed across different parts of the system. So that's the ambition for family hubs, is to get to somewhere that tries to bring that jigsaw of services together in a way that forms a picture that probably doesn't exist entirely at the moment. So for York, we were fortunate enough to receive £997,000. It is about a transformation programme. It isn't about delivering more services. So there won't be any of that money will go towards delivering another service. It is all about how do we bring those services together? How do we map them across the city? So, being fairly new to York as a professional, the one thing that has really caught my eye is the fact that there are a tremendous amount of voluntary organisations, community organisations, professional organisations, charities that exist in the city. They're not well mapped out in terms of how you access them, either as a parent, a child, or a professional. So hopefully, at the end of this piece of work, we will map those services together in a better way. You will be able to access that either digitally or through a building, but you won't be going. You won't be confused either as a parent or a professional in terms of how you access a number of different types of services. The funding is time limited. It only goes up to March 2024. So this really is a piece of work that needs to be done very quickly. As I've said, the family hubs will be a physical and digital concept. It's about improving access to services, reducing handoffs, and puts relationships at the heart of family help. So how do we help families help each other and help themselves, rather than just being reliant on a service that they've accessed? So how do we build that community strength? Not using communities in the sense of a family's direct network. So that's aunts, uncles, friends, people who they may have on Facebook, people that they may chat to in the pub, but that important network that sits around a family. So it tries to define, rather than a sort of sense of community, it tries to define something that's much closer to a family network. The DfE have developed a national framework, and we will need to ensure that our approach meets their expectations. However, most important, we need to transform for services in a way that are meaningful for families in York. So there's a lot of co-production, a lot of working with families, communities, members, to try and understand how do we try and knit that together for York. So far, we've set up an appropriate governance group, engaged multiple stakeholders in the city, and including a session that we did for members, and obviously this update this evening. As I've said, York's coming from a really strong position. It's got a long history of really excellent community approaches and community involvement. And whilst I recognise that that's getting harder, I still see that as a real strong, thriving group that exists within the city that you don't get in some other places. This is about having a graduated approach to families. So rather than having to turn up in a place, perhaps, if I use an example, perhaps of a young person that may well have a neurodiversity, may have autism. As a parent, you don't quite know what's happening, but what you can see is a set of behaviours that the parent's starting to struggle with, or a young person starting to struggle with. At the moment, the access is generally through your GP to then go on to a CAMS referral and to an assessment in terms of an autism assessment, and to be on a waiting list for a significant period of time. This is a sort of support now as you walk through the door approach. It's a social approach rather than a medical approach to supporting families. It's about when you walk into a building, and it might be somewhere like a community hub,
it might be a different building within the city, or you go on a website, you've got almost instant access to, parenting support. There may be instant access to advice and support around how to manage behaviours. There may be support about actually how do you, as a family, respond to a hypothesis that your child may well have autism, rather than you need to know about it, you need to have a diagnosis. And if anybody gets lost with what I'm saying, just please stop me. The report does try and clarify some of the similarities and differences between what exists in York in terms of different hubs, the autism hub, the community hubs, and what will be the family hubs. And the family hubs, community hubs may well be one of the same thing. We've yet to work that out in terms of what buildings we use. What we do know is that there's an expectation from the Department for Education that we have 3 family hubs, physical family hubs, as well as a digital offer. We will start early 2023 with a proof of concept, so we will identify a building, and that work is still going on, but it will certainly be in an area where we think we can best bring partnerships together, where partnerships are already working. In terms of proof of concept, we want to start from a base of what's working well already, rather than going into a place that is probably one of the more challenging areas to bring those partnerships together. There's a number of work streams in the report, but perhaps 2 of the most important are the information strategy, how we understand the landscape of services across the city and knit them together. How do we map the services together? How do we make sure that we keep on top of those in the future? Whether that's web-based access to services, all of that takes some sort of resource sat behind it, and we all need to think very carefully about if we're creating a web-based service where you can access, you can go on and click on a button to say you want to access mental health issues. How do we make sure that we continue to service that? So this will be about looking at what services are available already across agencies, and perhaps thinking from a transformation perspective about how do we do things differently, how do we use our joint resources differently, and perhaps at times bring them together. And workforce development, we'll work on developing a common language across professionals that work with children. Tremendous amount of people in the city that work and come across children on a daily basis and that support them. And many of those individuals can help young people not access services and families not access services that are further up the tier, if they have a common and sensible approach. So we will work to develop a common language across those professionals, use tried and tested tools, and training across multiple disciplines. And the training, I think, will probably be something that we've not done so much of in the past. Rather than train individual parts of the workforce in individual approaches, some of this will be about how we bring those together. So perhaps things like family network finding, how do we help families develop their own networks, is something that we may develop as a training package that goes across the city and across multiple professionals. So they're all coming from a common approach. We're working with the National Centre for Family Hubs in developing our local model, and we're working with York St John's on a systemic review, which will help us inform the national development and planning for this type of approach. It is, to a degree, a little bit like knitting fog. There isn't a prescriptive model of a family hub, so there isn't something the government have set in place to say, if you have this, this and this, that means you've got a family hub. It really is down to each individual area to work out for itself what important things it needs to knit together. And what we need to be mindful of is whenever you bring something together, you may disengage it from something else. So you need to make sure that we're not pulling things apart to put them back in a different place somewhere else that works for one thing, but we've just taken something that was working and made it worse than it was. We'll begin to see an emerging offer in 2023. We'll test the proof of concept, including the physical space, as I've suggested. There's a lot of work to do for us, I think, on a web-based approach. We will certainly make sure that there's access for every parent in the city around direct access to things like parenting programs, so self-help parenting programs, as well as access to parenting programs through groups of professionals and early help and early support. I'm going to stop talking there and give the opportunity for questions, because I think the report probably says everything else that I haven't said.
Thank you, Martin. It was very detailed. Thank you. I've got Councillor Webb and I've got Councillor Waller who wishes to speak. Councillor Webb.
Thanks, Martin. She said an awful lot of words there. Well done. Firstly, I mean, just a comment on our use of voluntary sector services, community services. It's fantastic that we do have them. And you're right, we have a proud history in York of public spirited people doing public spirited things. But it is a proud history because when it started, there was no alternative. Whereas quite frankly, we're in a position where we have had alternatives that have now been removed. And that's the fault of nobody in here, as I'm not blaming anybody in here. That is a national problem. I suppose a couple of questions on that vein. You mentioned very early on that they are not children's centres, they are not Sure Start. Communities are crying out for something like Sure Start. They're crying out for something like children's centres. So can you explain how they are not like those organisations? Because that's what people want. And when people see this, there's a natural tendency to go, great, that's going to be what it was. And of course it's not. So I think we need to be really honest about that. So can you just explain a little bit about difference around what these are compared to those examples? And my final point is the thing that everyone else will be thinking, where are these buildings going to be, and how will that decision process be made transparent and open? Thank you.
Okay, in terms of my comment around Sure Start children's centres, that's not to say that you won't see the same services being provided that you see within children's centres. I think children's centres were designed primarily to focus on a particular audience and to just target vulnerable and poverty rather than target all children. And they tended to, and I worked in a children's centre for many years, they tended to attract a group in society and exclude other groups in society. Family hubs are about inclusiveness for the whole of society. They're about making sure that they're all age groups. So you may well see a group session, something happening for teenagers as much as something that's happening for early years and school readiness. It's about that entire age group rather than just young children. And then when children go to school, we sort of drop off the services. This is about continuing services throughout childhood. In terms of the building issue, it is too early to say. We're doing an asset review to look at where we have buildings. Part of the challenge for our existing children's centres is they all exist on school sites, and therefore they would be problematic to a degree in providing the service to all the groups that I've just suggested, including adolescents and teenagers.
Thank you. Just as supplementary on that, Councillor Waller, you seem to disagree with Martin on his point about children's centres excluding certain groups and including certain others. I was wondering if either and or both of you wanted to sort of comment on that further.
I think my experience of when children's centres were operating, that they were very inclusive. In York, that may have been different in North Yorkshire. I mean, you know, different councils work differently. But I thought that the principle of there being targeted work with those young people and families that needed to took place, and then to avoid the buildings being stigmatized, there were universal offer in those buildings. I think that's a principle that I, as executive member, would take as vital for this, that these family centres should not be stigmatized, that these should be something that every family feels that having the opportunity to go there is a positive thing rather than a sign of difficulty.
And just on that, Councillor Waller, can you therefore guarantee that the choice of venues, we want to say that, will be open and transparent?
There will be a democratic process to establish those, and a demonstration of the sequential testing that has taken place.
Thank you. Any other points people wish to make? Martin, sorry.
Just to be clear, I don't think we're in disagreement. I think we're saying exactly the same thing, which that these centres will be inclusive. They will have a universal offer as well as a targeted offer, which is what I was describing. Wasn't describing anything else really. In terms of the buildings, it's just too early. We've got to do an asset review, and we've got to see what's available.
You ask in your report, Martin, would we wish to receive future updates? I think we certainly would. And I would suspect every 6 months at this stage, and we can be guided by you if you feel there's something you want us to debate. We'd be very happy to do that at any point, I'm sure. But yes, I'm sure you have this scrutiny committee support in your endeavours.
Yeah, more than happy to bring back something every 6 months, and if things are changing more rapidly, to bring something back sooner as well.
All right. That's a bit better.
Yes, I'm not going to ask a question really. I know you paint a good picture there, Martin, and I want to believe all of that. So really, I'm not going to ask any questions at this stage. I fully agree that we need updates, and I wish you well in this. I know you're passionate about it. I know it's what you've worked on previously in North Yorkshire, and yeah, I just wish you every success. And I don't mean to sound too cynical, but I know I do wish you well, and I look forward to the updates. And if there's anything we can do as elected members to support or whatever, I know we will.
Thank you. I was going to ask Martin, how do you think we present family hubs to communities so that families are not confused by the plethora, we use that word, of hubs on offer? Because I suspect some kind of branding might be helpful, but I'd love to hear your views.
Yeah, I think we will think about the branding, I think, which is going to be extremely important. Whilst the national branding is family hubs, we may want to call them something that's more meaningful for families in the city. That will be part of the co-production work that we do with families. We will be involving families and young people throughout the process in terms of making sure that they are attracting all members of the public. I think, again, I would like to point out the superb example that we've got in the city in terms of the community hubs that are already doing much of this work. This is an extension in many ways of what we see within the community hubs, and perhaps being a bit more targeted in some of the services that we can offer.
My second question really is, I think is a central tenet of the family hub, that families only have to tell their story once. So how do we actually achieve that in practice, do you think? Well, I appreciate there's an evolving development, but just a thought.
I think it's the right starting point to have as an ambition, isn't it? I think in reality, that's not going to happen to every member of every single person that walks through the door. But it's an ambition to make sure that we make life much easier for families that walk through the door and want a multiple set of services that meet the needs of that family, that the different dynamics that are going on within families. We've got some good examples already within the city. We've developing a social prescribing model for children and families with autism. And the social prescriber is somebody that holds the hand of that family to take them to services and introduces them to a service, rather than just say, here's a number, you need to go and phone up. So they'll make sure that they at least introduce the relationship. And it's those sorts of principles that we need to build within the service to make sure that we've got the ambition about you tell your story once. That's not to say that we will always achieve that on every occasion.
Thank you, Chair. And just to remind everyone of local area coordination is exactly that model in terms of people tell their story once, and they bring the agencies to that person to help them then move on to living their best life. So it's a very similar model.
Thank you, Pauline. Any other questions from this point? Thank you, Martin, for your paper. Thank you very much. Right, that brings us, I think, to the work plan. We don't have a great deal to talk to you about on it, but as we said earlier in response to a question from Councillor Webb, that the Ofsted report into children with special educational needs and disabilities is likely to take place early in the year, and therefore, because there was another paper which was time limited for economy in place that took the January slot, and in any case, Ofsted report probably wouldn't be ready as early as that. So we're going to have one, I think, on the 20th of February, date to be confirmed, to cover the Ofsted report into children with special educational needs and disabilities. Councillor Fitzpatrick. No, that's not the commission slot. Those are the regular meeting. Yes, Barry.
I think really we missed off the first topic tonight, and it would be quite nice to have had that really. I think there are things in that report that we can't. What are we saying? We can't pass it or anything. And we know that Tom Bird has been successful in achieving another appointment elsewhere, which is good for Tom, well deserved. But yeah, there are implications in there for us as a city and funding, etc. We need to need to discuss it. Will that come to the next meeting?
I think we
will. Tom still be in post?
I don't think he will by then. No, but we'll see if there's a deputy who can take up that role.
Okay, so we're not just going to
chair of the trustees and so on. Thank you. Any other points that people want to make? That's a web.
Just on school standards and the attainment gap, Maxine. This was sort of, we were putting it there because we were looking for validated data from last year's. Do you feel like we'll be in a position by very early March to have that stuff? And is it? Yeah.
Yeah, we've got the validated data early January. So yes, yeah.
Cheers, thanks.
Something else that I should have added on to what I said about Tom Bird and the theatre. Despite the fact that we haven't heard from him this evening, and I'm sure there's valid reasons for that, it might be nice for this committee to thank him for the work he's done for young people in the city through the theatre.
Indeed,
as he's leaving.
I would have done that had he been able to come tonight, but
yes,
I can write and do just that for you. Thank you. Any other points this evening? In that case, the meeting finishes at 19:22 with no urgent business. Thank you all very much for attending, and may I wish you all a happy Christmas.